As we've seen, Kim Jong-il died just last year, and even in the last 2 months, as we are one of 4 Canadian organizations actually working on the ground in the DPRK, we've seen some interesting changes. So I guess we'll really focus our presentation today on talking about what has happened in the last 5 years in the DPRK. What major shifts are we seeing as far as kind of both from a political perspective as well as a social perspective. I'll just introduce myself briefly. I know Greg said it, but my name is Matthew. I graduated from Brown in 2009, and upon graduating, we started this, Nick and myself started this organization based in Beijing, and now we're kind of relocating everything to Vancouver.
Yeah, my name is Nicholas Young. I graduated with Matt 2009, and I know Gregoire said this already, but I double majored in East Asian Studies and Economics. And we started East-West Coalition together during our last year in university. So now we've been doing it for about 3 years now. Really quickly, it's very useful to think of the Korean people, especially in the DPRK, as an extremely proud people, with an extremely long history. A history that, for the most part, was a united Korean peninsula. So when, during the Korean War, the Americans came and basically obliterated all of the cities in North Korea, Pyongyang was pretty much 99% destroyed. And the Pyongyang that we know today has been built up from the rubble of the 50s and from the war. Basically, from their perspective, a foreign power has come in to their country, killed a lot of people, bombed their buildings, and cut the country in two. So basically, of no fault of their own, because outside powers wanted to establish spheres of influence within the Korean peninsula, have one, split the country into two with an artificial border on the 38th parallel, which I'm sure you've heard about, the DMZ, and then also establish a puppet government in the south. Basically, there's American troops stationed in the south. South Korea has developed a very developed economy, especially during the 70s, the late 70s, in the 80s, and now is enjoying relative economic prosperity, incredible economic prosperity, especially during the Asian economic boom during the 80s and the 90s. So one of the ways North Koreans can rationalize, well, how are these other countries, especially the South, which has the same cultural heritage as we do, how are they so much more developed than us? Well, one of the things that they say to us, and this is anecdotally, is that, well, they have a different system. It's a capitalist system, and it doesn't necessarily reward everybody as equally. Also, they're a puppet government, so they're not making their decisions on their own, whereas for us, we have been able to persist from the very beginning all on our own without the help of foreign powers coming into our country and establishing governmental influence. So that's an extremely important point for them, and despite a lot of the poverty you see there, they're extremely proud of the fact that they've been able to maintain independence and don't have to rely on outside powers. Now, whether that is absolutely true or not, because they do rely on foreign aid, is something that does contribute to the complex relationship North Koreans have with the outside world, the complex way they view outsiders. And that's one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about today, because a lot of the times when you read about North Korea in the media, it's a very black and white account of what North Korea is like. And of course, you would assume that North Koreans see the outside world in a very black and white way as well. This is good, this is bad, these people are helpful, these people don't want to help us. But actually, it's a very nuanced and more complicated explanation, and that has a lot to do with both the history and, moving forward, what they want out of relationships with very specific countries that are both on their borders and in the West, and specifically the US. So that's one of the things that we actually, having worked there for the last 3 years, have been able to get a better grasp of. As Matt said, we talked to different departments, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Committee for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries, or even just youth travel, which brings a lot of tourists and students to the DPRK every year. All of them have different incentives and different channels by which they want to engage the outside world. So these are the kind of things that we want to share with you today, because it has a lot of implication for how North Korea will work moving forward in light of the death of Kim Jong-il.
And now we are where we are. And we've seen pundits in the media talk about, you know what, this is the end of North Korea. Kim Jong-il is dead. Kim Jong-un is 28, 29 years old, depending on if you judge him by his Korean age or his Western age. Can he really hold power? And you've seen, probably in the media, you've seen a lot of people say, absolutely not. That the beginning of the unraveling of the country has begun. But let me remind you that in 1994, when Kim Il-sung died, they said the same exact thing. And based on our experience and our work and reconnecting with all our partners in the last month in the country, that's not going to happen right now. That they're actually very stable. Future is uncertain, but they are stable. Claims of instability are not very true, to be honest. But let's talk about what has changed. In the last 10 years, market economics are a major driving force in the DPRK. Originally, we saw what we like to call an iron rice bowl. An iron rice bowl was a Chinese concept that said that the state will provide for the basic needs of the people. In North Korea today, the state is unable to provide for the basic needs of the people. Even us as an organization will get asked almost every month by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to send food aid. And food aid means grains. They want rice, they want corn, they want beans. That is something that we can't provide. And foreign governments don't want to provide. The Canadian government will not provide that. The American government will not provide that due to sanctions. And the reason why, and it's not necessarily a bad thing that they won't provide that, because in North Korea, there's no monitoring of food aid, no realistic monitoring of food aid. And that will go to feed Pyongyang. Pyongyang is a city of the elite. And the word elite is a very difficult concept to really grasp, because elite is always based relatively. Anybody who lives in Pyongyang, you can call elite, because they're elite compared to the rest of the country. Now within Pyongyang, there's still a class society, and there is social mobility. And market economics play a huge part in that. So there is a middle class in Pyongyang, there is an upper middle class in Pyongyang, and then there is a class in Pyongyang that no one knows about. There's a class in Pyongyang that if you walk around on the street, you will get to a blockade and you will not be able to pass because there's military surrounding a small corner of the city. That we call it the secret city. I've never been in there, I've never been allowed to be in there. But that's where the party central committee is located, and that's where ostensibly Kim Jong-un is living when he's in the city, and when all the major families that run the country, there are about 125 families that are running the country, they live in that area. Everybody else is at a different level of what we call elite, but the strata of elite is actually quite large.
The other thing is that there is a pervasive sense of fear in the country. So that if you do something that is deemed, that is seen as anti-government or possibly stirring trouble, they will throw you into, and I'm sure a lot of you know about this, these concentration camps. Now, the idea is here that if you get thrown into the concentration camp, and it's just you, then that's bad. That's something that is definitely not a good thing. But definitely not as bad as if your entire family, for example, gets kicked out of Pyongyang. Because as Matt was saying, to be able to live in Pyongyang and to have, let's say, an apartment, a TV, a computer, maybe even a car that the government gave you, these are all privileges that most people in the country do not have. And for the most part, people in Pyongyang are quite happy. They have pretty much everything they need. They're not free, but they're not suffering to the same extent as other people outside the city. So if they get kicked out of Pyongyang and denied these pleasures, it's a huge drop-off. And it's something that the elites in Pyongyang are very scared about. So this idea of fear and limited social mobility are keeping the elites in line. And I mean, I would argue that it's really the elites that matter in terms of the direction of the society. The peasants, really, they're not going to be mobilizing, and like I said, they're kept separate to begin with.
So when they deal with us, it's a little different, because they feel like we're outsiders, and when we're there, we build friendships over, some people very, very close. For us, we're a release for them, because they can tell me stuff that they would never tell a Korean, because they know I'm not going to tell them that. Because what risk am I to them? They know who I am. I've invited North Koreans abroad. As an organization, we bring North Koreans abroad every year, several of them. We actually have one North Korean at Cambridge right now in the UK. We have a North Korean undergraduate for the first time ever studying in Cambridge, which was a bit of a kind of a nervous test pilot for the Korean government, but we want to promote international education to grant young Koreans these opportunities. So this is the first, but we hope this is definitely not the last. And we've talked to Korean officials, we've talked to the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, and they'll say, what's the problem here? And they'll say, the issues are all the same. We understand the issues just like the West understands the issues. We understand, South Korea understands them, Japan, the States, everywhere else understands them. We see the problem in a different way. North Koreans see the problem, meaning the reason why these issues exist, as being a greater relationship problem. That it is our diplomatic position that harms us. And because we have no diplomatic relations with the US, there's a Western blockade. They call that the imperialist blockade. And because they see the West as still being imperialist because they're sitting in South Korea. If there's military troops in South Korea, that's imperialism to them. It is always, both North and South Korea always view one country, one peninsula. When North Koreans, they'll never refer to themselves as North Korea, it's DPRK. And DPRK means the entire peninsula, not just the northern half. So they say we're an occupied country. And so if the diplomatic issues were resolved, the army can leave, we can have peace, we can drop the economic sanctions, and we can trade. We'll be a developed country. We'll start to develop, and it'll be really fast. That's what North Korean government officials say. And do they mean it? They do. They do mean that. And North Korea in this position, I've had many meetings with, I work with the DPRK ambassador at the United Nations. And I'll sit down with Ambassador Han and we'll talk about this issue. And he'll say, we don't like our dependence on China. That publicly, yes, the relations are great. And they are. They're good. But as a country, we're completely dependent on them for everything. That every bit of economic trade, the vast majority, is being done with China. And that they have such a strong leverage over us that even in the mining sector, mining is a very sensitive issue in North Korea. Because what does China want out of North Korea? It's a poor country with people that the Chinese government is fed up with. China is not happy dealing with them. Chinese government officials are increasingly frustrated with North Korea. And remember that the nuclear tests are being done very close to the Chinese border. And China's very upset about that. China's upset about refugees or defectors coming across the border. There's a lot of issues that China has with that country. And a lot of people say, why does China control them? Why does China try to support them? Are they really a puppet master? And I'd say they're not. Actually, the fact that North Korea is conducting nuclear experiments near the Chinese border just shows how little control China has over North Korea. And China just is looking for stability, but the nuclear issue is also a major problem for China. This is one thing that everybody can agree on, is that they don't want a nuclear North Korea. So why does China support the North? Why does China continue to let them maintain the system that they have? And originally it was strategic. China looks at the world in terms of kind of hardcore politics. This is realist. For anyone who studied international relations, political science, China's really the realist. And they see North Korea as a buffer. And they see that there are American troops in the south. And they see that this is a threat to us, that we've seen it before. And we'd like to keep this buffer. Our relationship with the States, this is a very common kind of Chinese academic perspective, our relationship with the States is not well defined. We don't really know where it's going. And it's smarter for us, for the time being, to keep this buffer zone. Unless the buffer zone starts causing us more and more hardship. And that's what we're seeing now.
So over the next year, you're going to see a status quo, just because of the, like we were talking about, the geopolitical situation, and of course the domestic situation in the US. So that's why, as an NGO, to kind of bring it back to what we're doing, we are beginning to engage with North Korea in a way that governments can, and that big corporations can. And we're doing it through a different variety of channels. One of the things that we do is through education, trying to engage them by, one, bringing Western students to North Korea, which is something that a lot of people don't even think is possible. And then also going the other way, bringing North Korean students out of the country and putting them in Western universities to receive education. And doing this in a way where they're not, let's say, with a huge group of North Korean officials or other students where they're always being watched, and if you're kind of kept separate from all the other Western students, you kind of feel like you're living in a North Korean dorm in the middle of the UK. What we're doing, this last fall, we brought the first North Korean student out of the DPRK to Cambridge University. So now he's studying under a professor that we know through our network. And also he has a one-on-one mentor with a student that participated on one of our programs and went to North Korea with us. So the idea here is that he's really engaging the West through education. He's learning things, and our hope is that if he's going to become a future leader, he's one of the elites, he's from Pyongyang, if he's going to become a future leader, right, it's good to have him have his undergraduate, his initial education in the West. And hopefully he takes what he learns and he brings it back to Pyongyang and helps develop the country that way. In that sense, you're working through an education channel to kind of jump over the barriers that economic sanctions have established, and also this political stalemate has established. Because there's really, you have to think about, as an NGO, how can you get over that wall? What can you do? And the thing about education is that everybody thinks it's a valuable thing.